Join the conversation in Tipperary. Contact us through Facebook, Twitter or email tiptoday@tippfm.com.
Well, you're very welcome back to Tip Today with me, Stephen Gleeson, here this morning for Fran, and I'm delighted to be joined in the studio here just to talk about some global news with Thomas Conway. Good morning, Thomas.
Good morning, Stephen. How are you?
Good, and a lot going on in the world, right across the world. The Middle East is really just lit up at the moment, and not in a good way at all. And I suppose we'll start with the big visit tomorrow, the Taoiseach going to the Oval Office, and I suppose you could describe it as a minefield.
It is a minefield, and he will have to tread, I think, very carefully and put out his skills of diplomacy to his best possible level. But it's traditionally quite a jovial affair. This White House gathering began in 1952. It's been going for nearly 3/4 of a century now, and there's usually lots of backslapping, a blaze of goodwill, really, he's received in. But it's likely to be similar this time round. I suspect to a certain degree that Donald Trump will have one eye on the Middle East. He will be thinking of a meeting he has later in the week with the Japanese Prime Minister. And because of the fact that this is on St. Patrick's Day, he's not going to want to embarrass Ireland in the Oval Office. The Irish-American voter bloc, although it is diminishing in the States, was relatively good to him at the 2024 election. He will have that in mind. Now, there are a few thorny issues there, and it will be very interesting to see, will the Taoiseach raise them? That is, of course, the likes of Palestine and Gaza and everything that's going on there. The Iran war and the fact that it quite clearly is a breach of international law, what he has done there. And then there's the whole corporate tax question. So, I mean, the big question is, does Micheál Martin raise those issues? I'm not sure he will. I think the Taoiseach is a careful politician. He will not want to undermine Ireland's interests in any way. But then many other people would say he has an obligation to raise them, that he has an obligation to stand up for Irish values when he enters the Oval Office tomorrow. So it will be a very interesting affair. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out, but I don't expect any hiccups. There will be a press conference with Trump, and that is usually the main serving in any visit to the White House these days, and that is where there will be a risk for Micheál Martin. But I think he will play carefully, and I think he'll get on okay.
Leo Varadkar, former Taoiseach and coalition partner, said that Micheál Martin, that there was to Micheál Martin really, that there's no point in trying to challenge or confront Trump. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Donald Trump is so... he's so single-minded, he's so narrow-minded that it's very dangerous to confront him. We saw what happened to Volodymyr Zelensky last year in that dressing down in the Oval Office. There have been subsequent encounters. The South African president felt his wrath. But I have a feeling Donald Trump will be in good spirits. There is a celebratory atmosphere around St. Patrick's Day in the United States, as there is here. I mean, a tenth of the population has Irish-American heritage. I mentioned it, that's probably diminishing now as the generations pass, but it is still a big event in the annual calendar. And Donald Trump won't want to do anything to undermine that. I think really the main, the most interesting aspect for the day, as I say, will be that press conference, and it is likely to veer into Iran. And it will be interesting to judge whether Micheál Martin stays silent on that. I think he probably will. I can't see him intervening. I mean, you could stand up for international law. There is, I suppose, a danger there that an Irish journalist, as they are very entitled to do, will ask what you might call a difficult question, and how will the Taoiseach respond to that? But he will have been, he'll have been briefed on that, and journalists are there to ask questions. They're entitled to pose the question to both Donald Trump and our Taoiseach as to what they make of the war. So look, it is going to be very interesting, But there is there's a potential vulnerability there for Ireland. But I don't think, I think Micheál Martin is an experienced politician. I think he'll get on just fine.
It used to be so much simpler, really. I suppose a gift of shamrock to Harry Truman in 1952 ushered in that era of, Washington turning green. But times are very complex, and the US is probably, less popular now worldwide than ever.
You see that with the calls for him not to go. Now, I'm not sure that was ever an option, because once you decline the invitation once, I don't think it really ever comes again, regardless of who the president is. But even if you go back a few years ago when Joe Biden was in the Oval Office, and I know there was opposition towards him, but it was such a different affair. I mean, he had probably one of the most Irish American presidents. Donald Trump's only link to Ireland, I suppose, is his golf course. And that is something I should mention. Will he be invited? Will the Taoiseach issue the invitation to come perhaps and visit the Ryder Cup? Now that would create huge division, I think, here at home. But Micheál Martin may try something like that. I'm sure his diplomatic team will have discussed that at length, and that would make for a very interesting visit later in the year. But you're right. I mean, the ceremony and that has evolved over the course of the past 75 years or so. This will be among the most difficult of meetings, but Micheál Martin is well equipped to handle it. He's an experienced politician.
I suppose the wider media that will be there will be asking Trump about the Iran war, and Trump in particular, it is fair to say. There's an escalation trap there. The Iran war could become more costly and more complex for the US, and we're already feeling it here in Ireland with the price of fuel.
Yeah, and it's all down really to this passage of waterway in the Middle East, the Strait of Hormuz, which leads into the Persian Gulf. It's only 54 kilometres wide at its narrowest point, which is very slim in terms of a waterway, and 20% of the world's seaborne oil passes through. Now, because Iran has effective control of the Strait of Hormuz, it is a choke point, and it can use that. It can use its power there to escalate. Now, just over the course of night, or over the past 24 hours, Donald Trump has issued a call to senior allies, I suppose, the UK, Japan, Germany, to come in and help escort ships come through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, you don't need me to tell you the irony of Donald Trump asking for help when a couple of weeks ago, he was threatening to split up NATO and capture Greenland. But look, such is the realities that we live in. That will be very interesting. I believe Keir Starmer is due to make a speech later today, because it's in the world's interest that energy prices come down. I mean, there is no doubt here. This has created a huge energy crisis globally, particularly in Asia. But as you mentioned there, as John mentioned, and all your previous contributors this morning have mentioned diesel or petrol prices, and that just goes to the heart of it, and it shows how the effects of this war are hitting home. It then leads you to think, what options do both sides have here? And I suppose from an American perspective, you spoke about escalation there. They could escalate further. And if you bring that to its ultimate point, that would mean putting boots on the ground. Now, that would be wildly unpopular. Sending troops to the Middle East after the incursions in past years, that would be hugely unpopular. There is a little island off the Persian Gulf called Karg Island. The US ordered strikes in it over the weekend. That's a major oil exporting hub. Now, Trump has talked about taking that island since the 1980s. He's had kind of a fixation on that. So there is a question there. Does he send an American Marine force in, something like that, to take that little islet? It would be very interesting to see. But look, the Gulf states, they're an important player in this. Everybody is feeling very uncomfortable here. I think the longer this goes on, the higher the stakes are. And Donald Trump would kneel an off-ramp. He could declare victory at any moment and walk away, but you just do not know. That is the nature of Donald Trump.
And Iran have been planning for this for some time. Now, they've been defensive all along until provoked.
Yeah, look, Iran is widely regarded across the world as a rogue state. Now, you could call, many states a rogue state: Israel, North Korea, China. But the US has seen it as a mortal enemy. I mean, there is an animosity there between both Israel and the US and the United States for various reasons. Iran is sponsoring what they call proxy forces across the Middle East. But in this instance, there was an attempt at negotiation that had been ongoing with the Iranian foreign minister and Marco Rubio and an American team. But you're right to say Iran had been planning for this. I mean, they will dig their heels in. They had been planning for a long attritional war. Now, I'm not sure. I think the initial wave of the invasion, the tactics that the US implemented, were spot on from their perspective initially. I mean, that they took out the senior man, but they had no long-term strategy. And that's what we're seeing unfold now. Iran clearly has a long-term strategy. It has, the regime remains intact, despite the fact that it has been decapitated to a large degree, despite the fact that various senior leaders have been taken out. The regime remains in situ, and my estimation is it will probably endure. It will probably survive this latest US attack, and Donald Trump will walk away at some point in the next few weeks declaring victory, but not really having achieved it, because I think, to be honest with you, I think his goal here was regime change, and I think that was Israel's goal, quite clearly. But I don't think they're going to achieve it this time round.
Iran, an ancient civilization, thousands of years. The US really only has formed, less than, 250 years ago or thereabouts. So there's a huge contrast here when you look at the bigger picture. Yeah,
if you look at the Iranian Empire, it was once the Persian Empire. And that extends, as you said there, thousands of years way back into history. And although there are many opponents of the regime right now, and there's no doubt that the regime murdered and slaughtered thousands back in those protests in January, there are still people supporting it, and I was watching on Sky News last night a protest. You had two opposite protests. You'd one of them kind of cheering for the regime, one of them opposing it, and it just showed the level of division this was happening in London. This was external to Iran, but there is a level of division within the country that's there as well. But there is no doubt that it's a country, when a foreign force comes in and attacks your country. I mean, we've seen it with Ireland here in the past. It will trigger a national response, and I think Iranians will. I think the Iranian regime will endure as a result of this. As I said a minute ago, I don't think Donald Trump will walk away victorious, but it has all sorts of implications for the globe, and I think other world leaders are really feeling the pinch now, and really, wary of calling out Donald Trump, but not exactly inclined to agree with him either.
Talk to me, Thomas, about Turkey and their president and where Turkey stands in this, because they haven't really picked sides as such yet.
Yeah, I mean, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, is a very wily character. Now, to a certain extent, he's autocratic. I mean, there is an opposition leader there who is seen as a potential challenger to him that is now on trial in the courts for doing very little wrong and faces something like a 1,000-year jail sentence. His name is Ekrem İmamoğlu. It's a Turkish pronunciation. I might be getting it wrong, but he's an opponent to him. Erdogan is a seriously canny character, and in terms of his foreign policy, he's positioned himself carefully. Really, he stood against the war because it has implications for Turkey. Turkey actually shares an eastern border with Iran on its eastern front there, and he's fearful on a number of levels. One, it could trigger a refugee crisis from Iran into Turkey, like we saw with Syria in past years. Two, there is the prospect of a Kurdish uprising. Now, the Kurds, I mentioned with Fran in past weeks here, they're kind of an ethnic population. They populate Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria. And Mr. Erdogan in power in Turkey would be a vociferous opponent of the Kurds. So, Like, he doesn't want to see them in power. He doesn't want to see anything that improves their political standing in any of those countries. So he is wary of that threat. But he is playing a very kind of a delicate game here, because he has to keep the West on side. Worth noting that Turkey is a NATO member, so it's a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, which states that any attack on one is an attack on all. So if Turkey is attacked, it obliges other NATO members to attack or to defend it. Now, there have been missiles sent into Turkey's orbit thus far. They have been shot down, but it is a worrying sign, and it's another sign of escalation on Iran's behalf if it's willing to shoot out at Turkey. But really, it shows how strategic, you mentioned there with Iran and how historic a country that is. Turkey is also an extremely historic country, and its geography, like Iran, its geography is really important. It's kind of the frontier to the east, and many people will have gone there on holidays. Fantastic culture, fantastic sporting culture with its soccer teams, everything. But it's strategically in a very, very crucial place in the world, and I think it will be very interesting to see what emerges, what kind of cards the President Erdogan plays as this crisis continues to unfold.
And a lot going on across the world as well. Thomas, we're looking at North Korea, who fired missiles into the Sea of Japan, really, and that's another angle there on the whole thing. We see then in Cuba that the Trump administration, are really kind of stopping fuel going in, and a lot of people in Cuba are suffering as a result. So there's a lot happening around the world.
There's a huge amount happening, yeah. I mean, North Korea, I think, taking an opportunity. It's always a flashpoint, that region of the world, the Sea of Japan. North Korea, as you say correctly there, fired a missile, around 10 missiles, as America and South Korea carried out joint military exercises. That was over the course of the weekend. Kim Jong-un, we haven't heard much from him, but there is a reluctance to do anything to provoke North Korea and to provoke Kim Jong-un, because he now has a nuclear weapon, and that nuclear capability creates a deterrent factor. Kim Jong-un is capable of anything. They now talk that he's grooming his daughter to become his successor, so he's putting a line of succession there for his regime to continue. As you mentioned, Cuba there, obviously Cuba and the United States, far from allies, real opponents down through the years. But you are correct to say, largely this kind of almost a humanitarian crisis which is unfolding in Cuba is down to an American blockade. Now, the Americans will argue that Cuba is a communist country, it's an ally of Russia. But then again, when you see when people are starving and when there's a fuel crisis and that, I'm not sure that really cuts weight. I think when there is a humanitarian catastrophe on the brink of unfolding, I think someone has to do something to intervene. It's not fair on the citizens. And finally, I should mention France. There were crucial elections over the course of the weekend. The far right and the far left both making gains. There were mayoral elections in various cities. They will go to a runoff next Sunday, so I'll have an update on them. So, crucial elections in France, a lot happening across the world, but I think the focus for Micheál Martin is tomorrow's Oval Office meeting, but the focus for the world is Iran and the Strait of Hormuz.
And just briefly to finish, do you think that'll continue, the war over in the Middle East?
Yeah, I think we're looking at a 2 to 3 to 4 week scenario. I don't think Trump will sustain it any further than that, because I don't think he can afford to politically or economically. I think, as I said earlier, I think he will declare some sort of win, even if it's not a win, and walk away at that point with the Islamic regime still intact, and probably the world worse for it.
Great stuff. Thomas Conway, thanks for joining us here today. And
thanks, Stephen.
Loads of stuff there from Thomas. Just lots in on that, on the messages with just the Middle East, the flare points that are going on at the moment. And another message in here. Stephen, can you put this out to the listeners? I'm 25 and like you, I work in the media, but all the price increases in Ireland just have me down. I am living at home with my parents in their box room. I am barely making above minimum wage. I can't do this anymore. I'm a healthy young man, but I worry I will not be able to make make a life here in Ireland. Can anyone advise me on looking for work abroad? I really don't know where to turn, and I don't know how visas work. And that message has just come in there from James. So it just highlights how everything is linked here, the cost of living in Ireland and all. So a lot really to stew on there, but many thanks to Thomas for that here. And we're going to take a very quick break just before news.
Tipp FM's Tip Today.
With Slattery's Garage, puck on. It's time to change. Test drive the award-winning range of Peugeot hybrids and fully electric vehicles at Slattery's Garage today. See slatterysgarage.ie.